Born into ill health, likely thanks to inbreeding, Henri de Toulouse-Lautrec didn't live for very long, but in his prolific years as a painter, illustrator, and printmaker, he wielded an immensely impactful style as colorful as his life, spent boozing, schmoozing, and vigorously documenting the glamour and debauchery of Paris after dark. This is Several Circles. Bogish ladies and debonair gents hobnob in theaters, bars, and cafes. Lovers canoodle in their beds, and showgirls strut their stuff with gusto. Henri de Toulouse-Lautrec so avidly captured the spectacle and spirit of La Belle Époque, or the Beautiful Era, one of the most seductive periods in Parisian history. So naturally, we associate Lautrec with all the frills and frivolity of late 19th century Bohemia, but he actually hailed from an old aristocratic family, so aristocratic that his parents were first cousins, which accounts for Lautrec's infirmity. He was born to a count and countess in the provincial French city of Albi in 1864, the elder of two children, though his brother died in infancy. His bones were abnormally brittle from a hereditary disease, thought to be pycnodysostosis, posthumously known as Toulouse-Lautrec syndrome. After two consecutive accidents left him with fractured femurs in both of his thighs, his legs just stopped growing after age 14, and he maxed out at a height of under 5 feet. He would walk again, but with a cane and significant difficulty. Lautrec's condition precluded him from engaging in physical activities like horseback riding, so he participated as a keen observer instead. His initial training came by way of family friend René Poincetot, who specialized in equestrian paintings. The subject became dear to Lautrec too, but his unfurling personal narrative proved infinitely more essential than any formal tutelage. As he matured, Lautrec yearned for the exhilaration of urban life. He belonged in Paris, so off he went, age 18 in 1882, to study with Léon Bonnat, an esteemed painter, albeit stubborn in his fidelity to the tenets of academic art. As the city coaxed Lautrec's inner radical to the fore, he found himself especially enchanted by the Montmartre district around Bonnat's studio, where laborers and luminaries commingled, and local hangouts buzzed with talk of modernism, anarchy, and sexual liberation. For Lautrec, it was an awakening. Not the case for Bonnat, who resisted the charms of the avant-garde and condemned Lautrec's, quote, atrocious drawings for reading more like caricatures than faithful copies of what he saw. In a way, the self-deprecating Lautrec appreciated Bonnat's criticism, but the two were fundamentally incompatible. They represented the deepening rift between the old art establishment and the new. The opposing tides of tradition and modernity had been at odds since the mid-century, when Gustave Courbet's realist manifesto denounced the disingenuous idealism plaguing academic art and espoused the portrayal of the French condition as it really empirically was. In 1863, the Salon of the Refused gave an alternative platform to Courbet alongside a burgeoning group of mainstream rejects, Paul Cézanne and Camille Pissarro among them. And in 1874, both artists, together with Claude Monet, Edgar Degas, Alfred Sisley, and Bert Morisot, came out swinging with the first Impressionist exhibition. Come 1884, the first salon hosted by the newly formed Society of Independent Artists gave the official academic salon, which had practically monopolized French art since the 1600s, a run for its money. So enter Lautrec at this pivotal and exciting moment in art history. He and Bonnat parted ways in short order, after which he found a more nurturing teacher in Fernand Cormon. Cormon was also an academic painter, but he was more patient than Bonnat, possibly to a fault, as his leniency left Lautrec feeling unchallenged. Eventually, Lautrec quit his studies altogether. That said, the young artist's time with Cormon was imperative. It was in the studio that Lautrec befriended fellow pupil Vincent van Gogh, who, like Lautrec, went on to contribute monumentally to post-impressionism, which sought to amplify emotion with vivid colors and charged brushwork. Outside the studio, Cormon encouraged his students to give in to the city's magnetism and allow Paris to guide them toward the subjects that made them tick. Lautrec was lured into the demi-monde and fraternized with those whom society had relegated to the fringe. The so-called others abounded at the circus and in bordellos, and Lautrec, with a magnetic personality of his own, found both camaraderie and inspiration in the margins. But not all of his business was conducted in the shadows. He also adopted a plein air or outdoor practice, depicting some of his favorite muses in parks and gardens. One such muse was Suzanne Belladon, a circus performer with whom Lautrec had perhaps his only truly romantic relationship. Belladon also modeled for Pierre-Auguste Renoir, and thanks in part to Lautrec's mentorship, she became an accomplished artist herself. There was also Carmen Godin, who captivated Lautrec when he first spotted her on the street in 1884. An auburn-haired icon of the working class, she stood in for the anonymous masses with complex but mostly unsung narratives. And a prostitute, today remembered only by her nickname Golden Helmet for the way she styled her hair. The streetwalker boldly situates this lady of the night in the light of day, but she is immortalized with notable sensitivity. Lautrec jived with the rebellion and spontaneity of both Impressionism and post-impressionism, and he reimagined subjects tackled by the vanguardists whom he admired. He had such a knack for burrowing into the substrates of Parisian life, and he recast familiar scenes with a grittier edge, like Renoir's Dance at the Moulin de la Galette, which debuted at the Third Impressionist exhibition in 1877. Exhibited at the Salon des Indépendants in 1889, Lautrec's Moulin de la Galette is neither luminous nor ethereal like Renoir's. Mapped out on site and loosely executed in thinned oil paints in his studio, Lautrec's image is disquieting. He juxtaposes the rowdiness in the background with a foreground of cold, spacey figures in synthetic colors. Lautrec was also influenced by Edgar Degas, a master of the finicky pastel medium with a proclivity for the ballet. Degas' work boasted a realist bent, as he too was drawn to the dark side of pretty things. Pejoratively referred to as petite rats, many of the ballerinas whom he painted and sketched were poor, and they danced out of desperation to help feed their families. It became common practice for patrons to creep backstage and proposition them, and they would often leverage sex work for better lives. By the late 19th century, the ballet was all but dissolving, but in its decline, Lautrec found his niche. Spanning the end of the Franco-Prussian War in 1871 to the onset of the First World War in 1914, the Belle Époque is remembered as a period of peace, prosperity, and optimism, a trifecta that tends to fan the flames of uninhibited hedonism, which in turn makes for some fabulous uninhibited art. And much of the naughtiness that we associate with the era is thanks to the practically mythic Moulin Rouge, a decadent Montmartre dance hall. By the time it opened in 1889, Lautrec had a reputation as a daring illustrator of provocative characters, so the owners approached him with the opportunity of a lifetime to make a promotional poster broadcasting the unparalleled talent on offer. La Galoux, or the Glutton, Louise Weber, was the Moulin Rouge's headlining star, who high-kicked the top hats off of men's heads and delivered an erotic can-can number that could wrangle visitors in droves. Lautrec was tasked with designing a show-stopping advertisement, and the lithograph he delivered was chic, eye-catching, and decidedly exotic. Like Van Gogh, Monet, and Manet, Lautrec took cues from ukiyo-e woodblock prints. They were ultra-fashionable at the time, a product of Japan's Edo period, a golden age of pleasure-seeking not unlike the Belle Époque. Prints by ukiyo-e artists like Katsushika Hokusai and Utagawa Kuniyoshi flooded the European market in the latter half of the 19th century and propagated a taste for flat, elongated women and bold lines. It was a craze known as Japonisme, and the aesthetic would translate into the Art Nouveau posters of Alphonse Mucha and Théophile Steinlen. Some 3,000 copies of La Galoux circulated Paris and inaugurated Lautrec's bright but brief moment in the spotlight. Lautrec experimented with his new medium to yield vivid pictures, adding texture by spattering the ink to make them really sparkle. Lautrec would repeatedly revisit La Galoux in all her apparent exuberance, but he also lent his eye for character to the many other entertainers gracing Parisian venues. Like Yvette Gilbert, famous for swinging between speech and song in her cabaret performances, The dancer Jane Avril, whose enigmatic act was partially the result of a neurological disorder that caused frenzied movements, and Chocolat, one of the first successful black circus performers in Paris. The demand for Lautrec's posters was soon so astronomical that people would allegedly swipe them off of billboards while the glue was still wet. But Lautrec's legacy is more than his heaps of striking campaigns. In the early 1890s, he was asked to produce a portrait series of the resident courtesans at a brothel. Lautrec would basically move in while he worked on the commission, and in time, he became intensely familiar with the women who kept him company. Like Lautrec, they were accustomed to being judged, and a rare dynamic of mutual trust was formed. Lautrec scrutinized their traits and temperaments, and learned their true colors, which he transformed into numerous studies of intimacy between women, remarkably sentimental, and worlds away from the revelry of the Moulin Rouge. In 1896, his series entitled Elle presented another humane and almost mundane window into bordello life, a triumph of lithography, but not so much for Lautrec's publisher, whose focus was erotica. The portfolio lacked the titillating insight preferred by his clientele. But a round of poor sales could do little to topple Lautrec's career, only Lautrec, it seemed, was capable of his own destruction. The Belle Epoque wasn't quite as belle as it seemed, and all that excess came with a price. He enjoyed VIP status at the Moulin Rouge, and he was known to party into the wee hours. He would host wild dinner parties featuring eccentric foods and a cocktail of his own invention called the Earthquake, a seismic elixir of absinthe and cognac. Legend has it that he hollowed out his cane and filled it with booze, because despite his celebrity, he was increasingly self-conscious about his stature, so he'd kill the pain by drinking himself into a blind and sloppy stupor. His friend, Francois Gauzy, once remarked that Lautrec was often seen as a, quote, drunken, vice-ridden court jester, and he was ridiculed for associating with unsavory crowds. Degas asserted that Lautrec's brothel studies, quote, stank of syphilis, a disease that Lautrec contracted himself sometime in his 20s, and that wreaked havoc on his mental and physical health. He began to suffer from hallucinations and paranoid delusions. To make matters worse, he brought shame upon his family. His father was so outraged by his son's conduct that he disinherited Lautrec, and his uncle supposedly burned a number of his paintings. His mother was his only unconditional champion, or so he thought. Lautrec's instability reached a fever pitch when, in 1899, she suddenly and inexplicably distanced herself from him. Heartbroken, he collapsed, and he was committed to an asylum. He remained institutionalized for several months. In a bid to demonstrate his recovery, he made a series of drawings in a familiar theme. They convinced the doctors of his lucidity, thus buying his release, as he put it, with his art, but he was released back into temptation. In 1901, a stroke left him partially paralyzed, and he was taken to his mother in the hopes of achieving remission, but his prospects were bleak. His father came to see him off, to which Lautrec mustered his final words, "I knew, Papa, that you wouldn't miss the kill. The old fool." He died on September 9th, 1901, 2 months shy of his 37th birthday. Lautrec's memory survives in the outpour of posters, prints, paintings, and drawings made by the hundreds and thousands over the course of his career. In the dedicated Musée Toulouse-Lautrec in Albi, which houses the largest public collection of his art, and in Hollywood visions of life in the heyday of the Moulin Rouge, which tragically burned down in 1915. It also resounds in the work of his successors, in the paintings of Pablo Picasso, who was likewise drawn to the delights of Montmartre, in the photographs of Diane Arbus, who turned the lens on New York City's marginalized communities, in the silkscreens of Andy Warhol, who certainly shared Lautrec's fascination with superstars. But perhaps the most transcendent thing about Lautrec was the way he empathized with his subjects. They weren't merely subjects, they were kindred spirits. He humanized their lifestyles and memorialized their quirks, preventing, in many instances, the total erasure of their existence. After Lautrec, the artist's gaze meant something a little more profound. Thanks for watching Several Circles. Don't forget to subscribe for more videos about the lives and work of extraordinary artists from across history and the present day, and let us know in the comments if there's an artist you'd like to know more about.